He is he's developed a lot of expertise, somewhat against his will, in the area of ritual and cult abuse. He's the author of a book to be published in August entitled Cult and Ritual Abuse, Its History, Anthropology, and Recent Discovery in Contemporary America. And he still doesn't consider himself an expert, but I do. So without further ado, here's Dr. Noblet.
Actually, I'm not going to be a speaker right now. I'm just going to make a few comments and introduce the panel that we have today, which I'm in awe of the opportunity to stand up here with these gentlemen. I'm very happy that we've been able to attract such a profoundly skilled, well-known, courageous group of people to come here and talk. And I still can't get over it. This is something that I will remember the rest of my life. In any case, before I get into the individual introductions, a thought occurred to me that I might bring this up here. I was going to bring some cult paraphernalia, and this really is not one. It says sense of humor, and inside of it there's a pig's nose. There's a top and two rocks that you can hit together and it makes sparks. I got this as a gift from a survivor, and the survivor could see that the stories she was telling me were disturbing to hear. I was not happy to hear what she had to say. So she brought me this to remind me that all of us, all of us, we need to find some way through the horror of this experience to keep our humanity, to keep our sense of humor, to keep our sensitivity, to somehow avoid becoming numbed to the horror that we hear people talking about. And so I just wanted to mention that. I hope that throughout this conference we have the courage to face the horrors that are being reported and not to turn away, and at the same time that we don't lose our sense of humor. Now, with that in mind, I hope it's clear that there's no disrespect intended, that if from time to time someone should make a joke at, it's not necessarily meant to be personal. The only exception to that is with regard to the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, in which case every comment I make is intended to be personal. So, but aside from that, I want to introduce this magnificent group of gentlemen today, and I'm going to do it one by one. First of all, we have a gentleman that many of you, probably almost everyone here knows or has heard of. Some of you may have been fortunate enough to see or read his book, Operation Mind Control. I'd be interested in hearing more from Walter Bauert why I can't go to the store and buy a copy of it, and maybe he'll tell us all more about that. But he has an organization called the Freedom of Thought Foundation. And today, Walter Bauert, who is one of the eminent international experts on mind control, will speak to us a little bit on the subject of mind control. So I introduce to you Walter Bauert.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Pam. I haven't seen Alan Shefflin in, 25 years, when we went over all those CIA documents in, 1977?
76, 77.
And I was looking at people registering, and I was thinking, is that Alan? Is that Alan? You know how you do when you're trying to meet somebody at the airport and you haven't seen him for a year? But then immediately, as soon as I saw him, I recognized him again. And I see my old friend Ken Olson back there, who I knew in Phoenix, Arizona, when we worked together on the Bowles homicide case, which had a grim outcome, and it was not a story of mind control at all, but there were a lot of psychological twists and turns in that. I'm a journalist, and in 1978 I published a book that was published in 5 languages called Operation Mind Control, and I was paid full royalties for millions of copies. It was a bestseller. I went on a national tour in the United States. I did 98 radio and television interviews in 33 cities in 30 days. When I went through O'Hare Airport in Chicago, going out for 2 weeks, I saw racks and racks full of the book, and I came back 2 weeks later and there were none. But nobody seems to have that book. The book is now fetching $250 in the used bookstores, if you can find it, if it's in mint condition. If it's in tattered and torn dog-eared condition, that little $3 paperback is worth $20 today. I have since updated it, and I put out a thing that's 2 volumes, actually twice the size, and revised all my errors, because I didn't know what multiple personality was in those days, really. I didn't diagnose anything. I just reported what had happened. And today, doctors and psychiatrists, psychologists, and therapists are using the book and saying that's a multiple personality, Candy Jones and all the others that I mentioned. Since then, by that time, in 1978, before the book came out, I'd interviewed 300 survivors, and now I've interviewed thousands, and I've lost count. I've seen several patterns emerge, and one of them is the satanic or cult ritual abuse pattern, and the other one's the alien abduction experience. And I'm talking later in the week on that subject, and I have some very interesting charts and graphs that were developed by a psychologist who wishes to go anonymous, remain anonymous, and she and I have added the mind control to the comparison of descriptions and reports from people that report alien abduction experiences, ritual abuse, and the government mind control side of things. And it's very interesting for the similarities. There are so many similarities, it looks like one and the same thing, but it's worth discussing the differences, and that's what I'll be coming up. I want to I founded the Freedom of Thought Foundation because I'm trying to network people who I've known for now almost 30 years, and who are duplicating their efforts, a lot of them. Everybody's got a little group, and everybody's going in their own direction, and hasn't been much communication nationally and internationally. And for example, in Germany today, the prevalent belief system in the wards, and the psychiatric wards and hospitals, is that there's no such thing as MPD, and probably that's the way they'd like to keep it. Probably for years here, that was what gave the intelligence community the advantage, because these people, I think, were diagnosed primarily probably as schizophrenic or something in those days, or some kind of erratic diagnosis, which is happening today. You shift, you change the manual, the diagnostic manual, you get different diagnoses. And if you change the manual enough, you're going to have 10 or 12 different diagnosis for the same thing. I'm sure you've seen that. So I formed the Freedom of Thought Foundation for the purpose of networking, for the purpose of communicating this information. We publish a monthly newsletter. But to me, at least in my heart, the thing I kept running up against, and maybe Alan did too, and all of you have, is the National Security Act of 1947. It says, in the interest of national security, all your civil rights can be suspended. Criminals can be let loose because they work for the Department of Defense. And a lot of these people that have perpetrated the crimes that we've seen in the abuse, the sadistic abuse that we're describing here at this conference, and the thing that we call mind control, have done that under the charter of the National Security Act of 1947. The act covers probably more criminal behavior than it does secrets at this time. There's no more Cold War. So I think that the time has come for us to call for the abolition or the repeal of the National Security Act, and for us as citizens to take back our Bill of Rights and our Constitution. Thank you. And also to hold a Cold War crimes trial and prosecute these tyrants that have done this. Thank you. I feel the same way you do. March 15th last, Valerie Wolf testified before the President's Commission on Radiation. And through, I think, Randy and Mark, I was fortunate enough to talk to her before, almost during, and after the testimony. She took 2 survivors with her. One was amazing abilities that you very often find with reintegrated multiple personalities, or multiple personalities that aren't reintegrated for that matter. Incredible eidetic memory. And she had dates and codes and times and names of the doctors, and they named 6 doctors, among them Martin T. Orn of the University of Pennsylvania, somebody I've been trying to interview for 30 years. And he's always run. I almost got him on the golf course one time, but he's always run from me. Also, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA doctor, and Colonel L. Wilson Green, the U.S. Army Defense Intelligence Chemical Warfare Division, Defense Intelligence Agency. These men and 3 others who I didn't recognize their names were among the doctors and professionals that were named in this. I told a local doctor, a psychiatrist here one time talking on the phone, I said, you know, you psychiatrists created this mess, and it's going to be up to you to clean it up. And he agreed with me. And I said, well, then I'll give him a year or 2 and hold him to it. And if he doesn't get busy and do something about it, I'm going to add his name to the list. Because if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, as far as I'm concerned. You all know about the experimentation that was done on everyone. We are a nation of guinea pigs since 1940. And the earliest mind control situation that I've run across in the modern context was the situation of a naval officer who apparently was working either behind enemy lines. He was on one of the islands that were in Japanese territory. And so he got captured by the Japanese, and he was tortured. But before that, it seems as though he did some torturing himself. A lot of atrocities of war. So he had post-traumatic stress disorder, and the naval intelligence people used their techniques that were being developed in MK Ultra in those days to suppress his memories. He did not remember, and he died in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. He didn't remember a thing. He had a wife and children. He raised them. Almost 50 years went by. Everything was hunky-dory. He was blissfully oblivious, total amnesia. But then he started having cardiovascular accidents or strokes, and back came all these memories. And he died in terror, screaming the nightmares that he should have screamed back 50 years before. Now, that's a gruesome story. I hate to see a human being suffer, but there's hope in that story, because it means that memories cannot be suppressed, that all the memories are going to come back, that there's some kind of emulsion, like a film emulsion on the human soul that remembers things, and be that what it is. Also, the false memory, I call it Spindrome Foundation. And I hope you'll start using that term, because I think it is a spindrome and it is not a syndrome. Look up the word syndrome and you will find that what they're talking about is not a syndrome, it is a spindrome. Especially since it was Martin T. Orn who founded the organization and came up with the board of directors. Very important. This is a central intelligence agency action. It is an action aimed at the psychological and psychiatric and mental health community to discredit you, to keep you in fear and terror. And you're an easy group to terrorize, I want to tell you. You got license that the governments have issued, most of you. The therapists and social workers and others are freer, I think. And I think there's where the cutting edge is you're going to find it. My friend, who wishes to remain anonymous, a brilliant psychologist, told me, reminded me to not feel insecure about talking to you experienced hands in the fields of mental healing, because she said, these people need your input, because every advance that has ever occurred in psychology has come about from somebody outside of the community, from a non-professional. So a thing that I'd like to talk about, and I know Mark Phillips is very well aware of this, and Randy knows all about classical conditioning, and Mark calls it one thing, Randy calls it another, and I call it Neurolinguistics Programming, because I learned it from the president's therapist, Tony Anthony Robbins. And it was used in military and CIA training, and it is absolutely the Rosetta Stone for unlocking the human unconscious or subconscious or whatever you want to call it, the part where you're not conscious. And 90% of us are not conscious most of the time, you know. And so there is a system by which you can wake up and take charge, and you can, though it sounds like a cliche, a New Age cliche, you can create your own reality. You must create your own reality, and there's nobody going to do it but you, and we all must do it together. If you as therapists are finding that you've got your phones are ringing all the time, and you got patients all over you, and you've got no time, the meaning of communication is a response you get. And I think maybe instead of teaching these people how to fish, you are feeding them fish. And now you've got to start teaching them how to fish for themselves. And neurolinguistics programming is a very rapid and immediate, effective technique that you can adapt. Anthony Robbins doesn't call it neurolinguistics programming anymore. A guy named Richard Bandler, who had associations with the CIA, worked with a guy named John Grinder, who was more a family counselor. Most of you know this, but Bandler bragged to some of his students one time, "I bet I could commit murder and use this to get myself off." Several years later, he was involved in a murder trial, and he was declared innocent by a jury of his peers, I'm told. And it was very interesting, and it's in the book, Operation Mind Control, but the question comes up that since he boasted about it in the beginning, did he get away with exactly what he did? And every attorney needs to know neurolinguistics programming, and probably a lot of them do. Robbins uses the guy with the cowboy hat from Wyoming, what's his name?
Jerry Spence.
Jerry Spence is an example, and modeled Jerry Spence. Modeling is... I'm sure you all know about modeling. Some of you know NLP too as well, and call it what you will. It's Ericksonian technique. And I first learned some of it by my encounters with Milton Erickson. When I was writing Operation Mind Control, Dr. Erickson was found in the files, and he had, the way it appeared, he had used hypnosis to get a Japanese colonel to confess all the secrets of state. He said, no, he didn't do that, and Margaret Mead told him that the code of Bushido said if you touch these guys on the top of the head, they had to commit suicide. So I talked to this guy. There was a Marine with a rifle on him. He couldn't get anywhere. He was locked in a room. He could see the rifleman aiming at him through the windows. If he had done anything, he would have been a dead man. And I said to the guy, okay, you're dead now. Tell me the secrets. And the guy spilled the beans. So that was what I learned from Erickson, that the context, the manipulation of the context is what we're talking about with all of these things. What we see as sort of ritual abuse, mind control, or the alien abduction things, these are state-dependent things. These are dependent upon a state that's evoked and then anchored. And by collapsing the anchors, you can loosen the state, jar it loose, and deprogram people. We can go through the entire history. In 43, there was LSD discovered by Hoffman. In 47, the Army conducted all kinds of hypnosis experiments. In 50, Richard Helms accompanied, he's the DCI of CIA, he accompanied 2 doctors to the U.S. Embassy Annex in Japan, where 4 Japanese were interrogated under these new fledgling MK-Ultra techniques. That same year, the director of the 1950, the director of research addiction at the research center at Lexington, Kentucky, kept 7 men on LSD for 77 straight days, and then addicts were paid off in heroin if they took part in the drug experiments. In 51, McGill's University, Donald Hebb, and so on, and so on, and so on. And it hasn't stopped yet. What is it here? I have the date. 1994, the U.S. became a state party to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. The Senate had ratified it 4 years before it was signed, and I think the delay was because they wanted to finish up on some of you, finish up their tortures. Now it's illegal by international treaty. Whether or not we can enforce that remains to be seen. In order to enforce that, we have to abolish, repeal, just like our mom and dad repealed the Volstead Act. It said now we can drink a beer legally. We have to repeal the National Security Act. Thank you.
Well, I can see Mark Phillips chomping at the bit here. And indeed, Mark Phillips is another one of the distinguished people here to speak today. Many of you who are therapists probably have heard about Mark Phillips. I had heard about him some time ago and had the wonderful good fortune to meet him in Washington, D.C. at another conference just last year. He's an individual that has a tremendous amount of knowledge about programming, and he is a well-known individual who's consulted by therapists all around the United States, possibly other countries. I wouldn't be surprised. There's not too much I can say about Mark Phillips' background, but hopefully he'll say as much as he's able to say about that. Obviously, he had some professional work that involved contact with the federal government, where he was able to be exposed or become aware of certain things that are not normally aware, others of us are not aware of. In any case, one of my patients who I was mentioning to the patient that Mark Phillips would be coming. Phillips.
First of all, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here, for all of us, because we are here for you. I'm here to report who's winning, or perhaps won, the battle for the mind, and to give you some insight on how it was done. My perspective wasn't distorted from the vantage or viewpoint of being a survivor. I've worked with many survivors and have gained a tremendous amount of insight and knowledge from their experiences, but none from their perceptions. Perceptions are what were altered. That's the definition of mind control. Another definition is, of course, just controlling the information. The information that you're going to hear over the next 3 days, I believe, will change the way you think in a very positive way. When I mention who's winning or who's won the battle for the mind, perhaps many of you that I see familiar faces out there have heard me retell this story and feel senile. But when Jane Pauley was interviewing the deputy director of the KGB the morning after the fall of the Kremlin, when the tanks rolled back, it was all over with. This guy, they'd flown him all the way from Moscow all night long. They didn't have the courtesy to put him on a refitted SR-71 or a faster aircraft. So they managed to get him over to the airport in LaGuardia, and they put him on a helicopter and flew him to the top of the embassy building and rushed him down to the stairs. They were practically patting makeup on him as they ushered him out on the stage. Jane Pauley was most anxious to hear what he had to say. They interviewed him very briefly. Jane Pauley said, well, we're all here waiting to know, to what do you attribute the collapse of the Soviet Union? And this guy said it in perfect English. He looked right into the camera, beautifully. He said, the United States won the battle for the mind. She said, no, that's not why we flew you all the way over here. Let's talk about the economic situation in the Soviet Union. He said, well, the economic situation in the Soviet Union is part of the reason the United States won the battle for the mind. But he said, that's really all I have to say. That file tape we've got, it's extraordinarily difficult to get your hands on a copy of it because all that stuff was immediately squashed. But the message was extraordinarily clear. And this was only a few years after I had a meeting with the Defense Department in China. I had a joint venture with them, of which we'll get into all this during the next few days. But my background is rather sordid and perhaps colorful to some, not to me. To me, it's a conglomeration of mistakes that turned out well. But I recently was telling someone the story I started to tell you just then about the fact that we had sat there and watched this guy talk about this, and just 3 years previous, I found one of the main reasons that the United States had won the battle for the mind. That was Cathy O'Brien. I was alerted to the fact that she was a slave, a very high-level slave, and that she was the slave, or she was being handled by a fellow that I was doing some business with. And that's really how I became involved with her case. But after pulling her out, I was so naive, I thought there were lots of folks that could have helped her out. I didn't realize the technology for putting these people back together was probably as top secret as the fact that the battle for the mind was even being waged. Well, over a period of time, I was spoon-fed a treatment modality, as they call it in the biz, which amounted to nothing more than what I had learned some 2 decades previous, working on a contract with NASA. And it dealt with areas of behavioral modification and mind control, certainly not trauma-based. I worked in the areas of implants and that sort of thing. I'd also tell you that during the next few days, we'll have a chance to discuss what is real and what isn't real. There's a lot of hysteria out there with regards to implants and all sorts of things you're hearing, preposterous things, and many things that actually have, in fact, been items of research back in the 50s and the 60s and 70s. They were abandoned years ago. But there are some technological weaponry out there, they call it non-lethal, that I think each and every one of you should be entitled to know about. This is not a fantasy. There are U.S. patents being applied for, and Freedom of Information has managed to leak enough of this stuff out so that we have a pretty good overview without violating any national security laws. The battle for the mind, in essence, has been won, but there is a way out of this, and the way out is extraordinarily simple. Abolishing the National Securities Act is really the second step. The War Powers Act is the first step, and there is a bill before Congress, both houses, as we speak, that I believe will be approved. So once this domino effect begins to take effect, I'm certain that the National Securities Act will be the next to be repealed and rewritten so that this sort of criminal activity cannot continue. Like in Cathy O'Brien's case, the lady that I advocate for, she and her daughter, as well as a whole lot of others that you may, many of you know I advocate for, are direct victims of the CIA. I worked for the CIA for many years and did not know it. I know that sounds absolutely incredible, but it wasn't until 1993 that I was presented proof that I worked for the CIA all this year. I thought I was working for somebody else, another intelligence community, because we didn't really want to associate ourselves with the CIA. I went out of my way to avoid those people. But as it comes down, I have, since I met Cathy and since all of my past has come up like so much insects and cream, I've had to really make it a point to let people know that I'm not hiding anything. The only thing that I won't talk about are some of the issues that pertain to things that I was privy to that I had to sign for. I carried a secret clearance for many years. I carried a top secret clearance for a period of time, and during that period of time I was exposed to some things involving behavioral modification, which quite frankly should be in everybody's books because it's it's ridiculous and there's nothing to it. The real heavy-duty stuff I found in personal research, which spanned about 25 years. And although my research was not in the area of trauma-based mind control, it was in an area of neurolinguistics, the language of the subconscious. Let me put a label on that one. But over the next few days, we hope to impart enough information so that each and every one of you can walk away from here with something of extraordinary importance to your individual situation. Again, I want to thank you with everything I am for having this opportunity. And one of the gentlemen that I'm here to hear speak, of course, Walter Bauer has been a good friend of mine for a while, and many other people involved in this venture I've known for quite some time. I've had the luxury of having a lot of telephone conversations and personal visits with. But Dr. Shefflin, to my left, is someone that I've been wanting to listen to since I listened to a fifth-generation copy of the tape of yours and read pieces of your International Law Journal you wrote in 1982. So I'm not going to introduce you. That's your job. But I want to thank you all very, very much one more time, and we'll be getting into some really heavy stuff. I will answer absolutely any question that I possibly can for you, and if I need help, I'll call on my trusty assistant, Cathy O'Brien. But if there is anything that you are not comfortable with asking in front of a group, you may catch me somewhere moving around, and I'll be happy to answer it if I can. I'm learning too. This is a huge education.
As the bunkhouse. There's no way that anyone should have known this information because I was not supposed to have been in there, but nevertheless I was. I also know what kind of sheets Ronald Reagan has on his bed. They're flannel sheets, light blue flannel sheets, LL Bean. I have a lot of details in there that are irrefutable, and a lot of people are fully well aware of already. There's a lot of information there pertaining to NAFTA. I was used to implement the groundwork for NAFTA between Reagan, De La Madrid, under the orders of George Bush. It was my understanding that De La Madrid was more or less a figurehead in Mexico the same way Reagan was here, with the vice president of Mexico actually running the country, and that vice president at the time was Salinas. I delivered messages to and from them, was prostituted to De La Madrid on numerous occasions. And the opening of the Mexican-Juarez border for the groundwork of NAFTA was actually the opening of free trade of drugs into this country and free trade of our nation's children across the border. I was also involved in drug operations, the CIA's so-called war on drugs. It's my experience that the only war on drugs was the CIA eliminating their competition. And the war was taken to our streets and has turned our streets into a bloodbath over drugs that the CIA has brought in. Another operation that I was privy to was the Global Education 2000 program. I am deeply disturbed at what's being done to our children, and there's an enormous movement across this country to take back our schools because people are sending their children to schools and don't recognize them when they come back out. This Global Education Project was something that I was also involved in delivering messages to all the state governors under the direction of then Secretary of Education Bill Bennett, who incidentally makes it very clear that he is a Jesuit. And his so-called Book of Virtues is the little shield that he's masquerading under and hiding his criminal activity under. But nevertheless, Bill Bennett was heavily involved in bringing mind control into the school system. It's interesting to note, too, that Bill Bennett later went on to become George Bush's so-called drug czar. I also, in my work with that I was forced to carry out for this Global Education Project, I was involved with former Tennessee Governor Lamar Alexander. Lamar Alexander later went on to become an education secretary. Look what he's done to our school system. I know for a fact since 1977, when I was subjected to an occult ritual in Nashville, Tennessee, that Lamar Alexander believes in using Satanism as a trauma base for mind control. And now Lamar Alexander's vying for the office of president? One person that I had become friends with over the years, although as a mind-controlled slave, I couldn't think for myself, and I couldn't think to make any friends, and I had this obnoxious cover personality that really kept people at a distance. I acted like an airhead, you know, and which was really somehow fitting when I had my handler was so much older than I was, and we were traveling the country music industry. People just assume that's the way things should be. Well, nevertheless, I developed a friendship with one girl that I had been traumatized with. This friendship was one that was derived from having endured severe trauma together, mind control programming at Youngstown Charm School, where U.S. Congressman Jim Trafficant decided when girls had learned their lessons sexually and could leave that torturous place. But this girl and I had become friends, and I'm deeply concerned for her welfare as well as the welfare of so many, many others that I know are still involved, as well as my own brothers and sisters. This girl was the mind control slave of another presidential candidate, Arlen Specter. Arlen Specter, like Gerald Ford, was involved in the Warren Commission, and he's also involved in mind control and firmly believes in mind control of the masses. These different operations that I was forced to participate in was something that I never would have done had I had my own free will. But I'd lost my free will until I was deprogrammed. In 1988, Mark Phillips rescued Kelly and I from our mind control existence. As he stated, Kelly went into the hospital with respiratory failure because when she felt safe for the first time in the safety and serenity of Alaska, the memories of what she had endured began flooding her mind. And as quickly as that happened, she went into respiratory failure and went into the intensive care unit. In Alaska, she was diagnosed with multiple personality disorder with high-tech mind control programming. Nevertheless, the state of Tennessee took custody of Kelly through a series of elaborate events. And when they took custody of her, they refused to accept any documentation from outside the state of Tennessee. They claim that there's nothing wrong with her and have denied her rehabilitation due to who and what she would remember were she allowed to be rehabilitated. Kelly remains a political prisoner in the custody of the state of Tennessee. She knows that I didn't contribute to her abuse. She knows that I couldn't prevent her abuse due to my own victimization. And we have a close, loving relationship that goes, I think, even significantly beyond a mother-daughter relationship, because we've also got that kind that people tend to develop when they've been through severe trauma together. We've got a unique bond, and we have a deep understanding. And she's counting on me now to be a mouthpiece for her and to get the word out on mind control so that she's understood and so that she's freed from her continued victimization by the state of Tennessee. Mark Phillips taught me the ins and outs of my own mind as my memories too began flashing. I learned to journal them, to write them out. The very act of writing bypassed the emotional and put them into a logical sense where I could actually begin retrieving the exact memories of what had happened during those years. It was only through this method that I was able to deprogram the program first. This was the only way that I was able to circumvent that scramble of fantasy and reality. That was how I learned that when I heard one of my abusers saying, "I am an alien, I will make my thoughts your thoughts," that I was able to logically question and reason for the first time and say, why didn't he just do it? Why did he have to tell me that he was going to make his thoughts my thoughts? Obviously, it was a manipulation technique, and I learned to see through the illusions that were created. When I learned to see through the illusions, I learned this is within my realm to affect. Nevertheless, I was furious, absolutely furious over what had been done to my daughter and I both. I really couldn't think of anything that would be vile enough and horrible enough to do back to any of our abusers that would make up for what they'd done to us. There was no way to do that. And Mark Phillips wisely told me at that time, he said, the greatest revenge is total recovery. And he said the mightiest weapon is the pen. And he gave me a pen. That was the second gift. The first gift he ever gave me was the time of day. Because I didn't even know what year it was. I didn't know how old I was. I had no ability to keep track of time since I had no conscious awareness under mind control. And he presented me with a watch. And he said, from now on, I better be keeping track of time. That way, I would learn to notice when and if any was missing. And I learned to take control of my life at that point. So I used this power of the pen to write out all my memories in photographic detail of exactly what happened to my daughter and I both. The ones that have been absolutely validated and are ready for congressional hearing are in our book, Transformation of America. And it details this world domination effort through mind control of the masses. As I wrote out these memories, I was able to use a lot of logic to deal with the reality of what had happened. I feel extremely fortunate not only to have survived my mind control ordeal, but that Mark Phillips had the expertise to help me recover my mind and my memory. In the process, I gained control over my own mind again. By gaining control over my own mind, I had free will. I could carry out exactly what I wanted to do. By having my God-given free will back, I was able to reconnect with my spirituality. I'd been separated from my spirituality for all those years under mind control. Although I couldn't reach the spirituality, neither could they. That's why they never considered the strength of the human spirit. They're unable to touch it. They cannot reach it, even through absolute, total, robotic, traumatic mind control. They cannot affect the human spirit because of the God-given free will. There's kind of somewhere a boundary in between and has it twice removed. So I regained my ability to think for myself. I regained my memory. I gained control over my own mind and life, my actions, and I was able to exhibit and actually live my own free will, my own spirituality, which was absolutely, no question about it, harmoniously tuned to God's will. This spirituality also is something that I believe gave me the ability to have emotions again and to care and to realize that good people do exist and that good people are not going to tolerate what's been going on. My abusers often said, that they were counting on good people to do nothing because they knew good people could not think to look beyond the smoke and mirrors illusions to the criminal activity that was going on behind the scenes. Because good people don't think criminally. They just don't think to look for it. So by revealing the secrets that they've been keeping from us under this blanket of so-called national security, we are able to gain control over our lives once again. It is truth that sets us free. They've been operating on the belief that secret knowledge equals power. Once we have control of those secrets, their power diminishes. Knowledge is our only defense against mind control. When we know exactly who and what we're up against, we can no longer be deliberately diverted to other aspects of what they're claiming is the problem, which has actually been dividing us all with the hate crimes that they keep bringing up in front of us, and they keep pointing all different directions as to what the problem is. The fact of the matter is the problem is they're ushering in the New World Order by manipulating our minds. Now, united with the facts and the truth, we can clearly see exactly what's been happening to our country and our world, and we can effectively take back our schools, take back our churches, take back our streets, take back our country, and take back our world. Please spread the word. Thank you.
We appreciate you all tonight being here. I promised Cathy that we would live long enough to see this day. Now, tomorrow, we've got a workshop, and it'll give us the opportunity to answer any individual questions and really reach a depth of understanding of the various types of mind control and mind manipulation. I do come out of the advertising marketing world, so I can tell you about those real easy. Well, all you got to do is look at a perfume ad, an automobile ad, preferably Lexus, or a Marine Corps ad, and you can see the ultimate in subliminal advertising. But we would like very much to have the opportunity to address your questions, because this is too short a period of time to cover all the material necessary. We just wanted to give you a basis of understanding of what's going on out there. You folks, I hope you're enjoying this as much as we are, this Congress, and having it all brought together in one place. We hope to see this again another day, another time. Thank you. Good night.
Believing in things like mind control, it's my function to show that the subject has validation across several centuries, and especially a rich history in this century. What I want to do is to use slides to illustrate my talk, and so if we could lower the lights, you'd be able to see the slides better, and let me begin. Can we, yeah. Great, let me see. All right. Naturally, the history of mind control begins with the proverbial hole in the head. This is an illustration of a Trepan Skull, the first known medical intervention for mental illness. There are many such skulls that have been recovered from civilizations throughout the world, suggesting that trephaning, which is, as you can tell, an early form of lobotomy, was well practiced by many ancient civilizations. The reason why the proverbial hole in the head here is important to us is that this was a therapeutic procedure built upon a medical philosophy, and the philosophy is one of possession. It seems to me that in many ways, as I'll suggest to you, these notions have come back again in the 20th century, and so I thought it appropriate to start with them now. The possession idea carried through well to the Middle Ages, when possession theories of mental illness were prevalent, and cures based on them were equally as prevalent and indeed necessary. This is an illustration of medieval moon madness and some of the dancing episodes that went throughout the Middle Ages. The treatment of choice was exorcism, which you see an illustration of here. If you look all the way over on the left, the woman being held by a group of men, there's a devil coming out of her head. This was, of course, the early equivalent of multiple personality disorder. And the notion of possession theory, the body being inhabited by other beings, is an important aspect of dissociation. The theory may have changed somewhat, but there is certainly a direct history from the possession ideas to the dissociation ideas that we experience today. The first real treatise, I think, in mind control, which brought together possession ideas into a textbook, is the Malleus Maleficarum, which is written in 1484. It's called The Witch's Hammer. And I was interested to note that in the latest issue of, I think, Newsweek magazine, with the cover story on the brain, there is a one-page description of the Malleus Maleficarum by a novelist who wrote a woman's novel based on its terms. The Malleus was used as a Bible for witch hunting, and it tells you how to identify witches and how especially to interrogate them and how to cure them, the cure usually being killing them. But the value of the Malleus, I think, is twofold. It is probably the second known textbook in history on cross-examination techniques, the first one being the Platonic Dialogues. And so we get in the Malleus a systemization of the knowledge of how to do interrogations to lead people to get confessions that you want them to give. And so in the history of mind control, it plays a very important role because this is the work that was used by the inquisitors throughout the Middle Ages and thereafter to obtain confessions, and indeed false confessions. The Malleus itself then was read by police departments centuries later and used as the beginning of the development of police manuals. Let me jump ahead a couple of centuries until last century, the 1800s, with the birth of psychiatry. And it perhaps is no surprise that there is a common link to possession theories and the birth of psychiatry, in that most psychiatric treatments had the same element of violence that we see in the Malleus and that we see in the exorcism and beyond that. It's to cast the demons out. I'm going to run through a series of slides here, all taken from psychiatric textbooks, on the way in which people were treated. This one is an individual who was chained to a wall. And this is a form of a straitjacket, as you can see, where a person is tied directly to a drain pipe in the wall. Here is an early version of the straitjacket itself. It was believed that these people were inhabited by demons, and that in order to get those demons out, exorcism was replaced either with violence or with severe restraint. But a century ago, they also had something that we tend to consider as modern, but is not, shock treatment. The shock treatment done, however, was usually a different form than electricity, since they had not yet invented electricity. This is a water shock treatment, and another version of it appears here, where an individual is led blindfold on the platform. Suddenly the platform falls from beneath him, and he's dumped into a bucket of ice-cold water. This was intended to be shocking. Another form of shock treatment was to fire a cannon behind somebody without them knowing that was going to happen. Again, the idea was to use a form of violent cure because of a theory of violent possession. Interestingly enough, even electric shock has a history in antiquity. We did not need the development of electricity to have electric shock. The ancient Egyptians used to take a torpedo fish and slap it on the forehead of people who were possessed, and the fish would discharge an electric current. And that's the earliest record of electroshock treatment. This is a device that nobody can ever guess the importance of. It's an ovary compressor, and I'll leave it to your imagination to consider how painful it must be to have experienced it. Seclusion, in its worst form, is the wooden crib here. This is a form of containment in which you can see the person is totally strapped into a crib with no way to move. This, however, it was not the worst form of restraint. It took a leading psychiatrist to develop that. This is the rotating chair. A person could last only a few seconds in this chair without becoming nauseous and eventually losing consciousness. And then there was the tranquilizing chair. All of these devices were used in the late 1800s. The last two of them were developed by Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and his face appears on the seal of the American Psychiatric Association as its founder. It's not my desire to criticize psychiatry here, but rather to make the point in terms of mind control that we began studying the human mind and mental illness with a theory of possession and a theory of cure based on violence. And from that we'll see the various refinements. Perhaps the first of the refinements, and the one that's notoriously wrong, was the leading psychological theory of the 1800s, and that is phrenology, that you could measure the exterior of the brain, or rather of the skull, in order to understand the interior of the mind. This is an illustration of a phrenologist's chart, the theory being that there is a direct correlation between a person's characteristics as an individual and their skulls and the lumps and other aspects to be found on the skull. The theory, of course, is completely wrong, but it occupied a good deal of the 1800s and was the leading theory of psychology at that time. It led to further variants in terms of face reading. The importance of the theory is not that it was wrong, but rather that it led people to begin to try to measure internal states. And so from an erroneous theory, people began to look inside the brain to see how you can find external correlations with the brain. And we come across what I think is the great paradox in all of healing, and that is that the more you learn how to cure people, the more you learn how to harm them. And for every step forward in relieving mental illness, you can take a step backwards in causing it. And so for people whose interest is in control of the mind, their data comes from how to help the mind. And so there is no step forward that does not involve equally in the hands of malevolent people a step backwards. The idea of mind control turned more serious, however, and our concerns more contemporary when we come to hypnosis. This is Hypnos, the Greek god of sleep. Of course, hypnosis is not sleep, and so the name itself is deceptive as to the mechanism of hypnosis. But hypnosis began the modern era with Mesmer, whose theories were also wrong on planet, not only wrong but plagiarized on planetary magnetism affecting mental states and so forth. What Mesmer really happened upon, without realizing it, was the beginning of the idea of the laws of suggestion. And what he did is set up what's called a baquette. And you can see here it's an oak tub from which iron bars extrude, and the French nobility would come and touch the iron bars, which were in the tub. The tub was filled with water with iron filings, and people would then have convulsive states, which were pleasant enough for them to repeat quite frequently. Some slides of the baquette. This was high society, not only treatment but also entertainment. You can see at the left a woman has fainted. That was quite common. Here's a color slide of the same kind of event. Mesmer work was studied by a presidential commission, rather a king's commission. King Louis XVI appointed a special commission to study mesmerism. At the time, it was receiving rave notices from the public and condemnation from medical societies. Here's a cartoon at the time of animal magnetism. You can see the animal doing the hypnosis, and another cartoon debunking animal magnetism. The report that was issued on the work of Mesmer's student, Deslon, was highly critical. The commission found that there was nothing to the interplanetary theories and the magnetic theories, but they were then forced to explain why Mesmer got so many cures. And they attributed the cures to the power of imagination. Rather than study the power of imagination as a way to cure individuals, the commission left the issue alone, and it took 100 years for people to pick up that essential point that manipulation of the imagination could be used to manipulate the mind. The commission also issued a secondary report that was stamped eyes only, for the king's eyes only. And in that report, the commissioner said that there was an aspect of magnetism that was so dangerous that the practice should be stopped at once. It was a menace to morals, that the attraction that developed between the magnetizer and the subject being magnetized was so great that seductions were inevitable. And therefore we have the first inkling of the relationship between hypnosis and hypnotic seduction in this secret report for the king's eyes only. Mesmer died in disgrace and in exile after the report appeared, and hypnosis, which was still called animal magnetism of the time, fell into disgrace but not into complete abandonment. It wasn't until about 50 or 60 years later that James Braid, a Scottish physician, coined the term hypnosis and hypnotism, and it wasn't until about 50 years after that that hypnosis begins to be studied in a serious way, and the problems of mind control using hypnosis as the vehicle again resurface. The Victorians were interested in hypnosis because it was fun to be hypnotized. They lacked the joys that we have, such as Geraldo, and so they had to entertain themselves by using hypnosis for their parlor games. And you can see a man here drinking milk out of a saucer on the floor. He had just been hypnotized. And so stage hypnosis at the turn of the century, from the 1890s through the 1910s and 20s, was one of the most well-known and well-attended and lucrative forms of entertainment. Just a couple of artifacts from that period of time. Here's a brochure from the stage hypnotism show. Walter Bodie, an English hypnotist, was perhaps one of the most famous of the stage performers. He had a hypnosis and electrical show. You can see on there a statement, the real Trilby Going back to Svengali, we'll return to that in a moment. This is James Bodie. He lives on in history for a reason people don't remember anymore, and that is he was the inspiration for an extremely young comic who got his start by mimicking Bodie. And here's the young comic. Here's the two of them together. Bodie on the right and Charlie Chaplin on the left. And so Charlie Chaplin's career began by studying Bodie's mechanisms and his mannerisms on stage, and then making comedy of them. During the Victorian era, people's exposure to hypnosis was not only as a form of entertainment, but it seemed like a form of mind control as well. You could get people to do anything that you asked of them. You could have them be suspended between two chairs. You could even stand on them when they're suspended between two chairs. And you could do a lot worse as well. If you're sensitive, please don't watch the next two slides. This is an iron bar held by eyelets put into the eyelids of a subject. And this is a stage hypnotist in Georgia. And as if that isn't bad enough to suspend an iron bar from the eyelids, he took it one step further and then pulled a young woman on roller skates. So it's not always fun to be hypnotized. And some people have taken the idea of stage hypnosis, it seems to me, far beyond where it should be entitled to go. One of those people is Barry Konikoff, who in one of his later, he has self-hypnosis tapes which were available all over the place. I've heard he's gone bankrupt now, and I certainly hope that's true. In his later round of tapes, he argued that women who have been sexually abused or raped deserve it because of what they did in prior lives. Now, the First Amendment perhaps protects that. On the other hand, there aren't words that would describe a person who would make money out of that kind of a theory, so I won't waste our time on him. I want to get back to the central theme of mind control, which starts with Jean-Martin Charcot, who was the foremost neurologist at the time. While the stage hypnotists were persuading people that minds could be controlled by hypnosis, the professionals were learning hypnosis as well, and they were learning it largely from a small group of people, the most influential of whom was Charcot. Charcot, as the greatest neurologist in Europe at the time, was frequently visited by kings and princes and certainly all of the most elite of the medical profession from around the world. And in his clinic at La Salpêtrière in Paris, he would demonstrate hypnotic phenomenon. He would, in his demonstrations, induce neurotic symptoms in people. People who came in with an inability to move one limb in hypnosis would be able to move that limb, but he would transfer the neurotic symptom to the other limb, and so he could create and destroy and eliminate and transpose neurotic conditions. And this was a remarkable demonstration which impressed a number of people in the audience, but his theories were at odds with his major contemporaries, Libaud, who was on the left, and Hippolyte Bernheim, who's on the right. There was, in France at the time, this second school of thought about hypnosis. Charcot believed that people who could be hypnotized were hysterics, and that hypnosis was a form of hysterical dissociation. Bernheim, based on the work of Libaud and his own work thereafter, believed that hypnosis was a form of suggestion, and that the manipulation of suggestion did not need a former neurotic condition. Here's Bernheim. Bernheim and Charcot often appeared against each other in a series of criminal cases that appeared throughout France on the issue of the antisocial production of crime with hypnosis. A person who studied from both of these people and was influenced by both of them was Sigmund Freud. This is a picture of him on his wedding day. and a better-known portrait of him in his old age, and then the infamous couch. In his London office, over the couch, Freud had a picture of Charcot doing the demonstration that I showed you a few slides back. Let me get to that. This was a picture that hung over the couch in Freud's office in England. Now, Freud was very much influenced by the hypnosis theories and worked with hypnosis for a year, but then abandoned it. And it wasn't clear why he did abandon hypnosis. Some theorists have argued, and I think correctly, that he was a lousy hypnotist, and that seemed to be true. And he couldn't, as a result, get deep enough trances to have effect on his patients. Other theorists have argued, and Freud's own writings tend to support a secondary hypothesis, and that is that Freud was scared of the seductive power of hypnosis, that the ability to move people into altered states of consciousness gave a feeling to the hypnotist of some such omnipotence that it was in itself seductive. And Freud wrote that in one of his patients, as soon as the hypnotic encounter had ended, she jumped up and threw her arms around him and hugged and kissed him. And he did not attribute that to his handsome demeanor. He said it must be some other force at work, and it so frightened him, he said, that he never used hypnosis again. And I think that he's harking back to the Mesmer Commission's noticing that there is a manipulative power in hypnosis that the subject may not be able to resist, but also the hypnotizer may not be able to resist as well. Bernheim, by the way, and Albert Moll, a German hypnotist in the 1880s and 1890s, had already given the world the false memory syndrome. They called it retroactive hallucinations at the time, and they wrote quite openly in their works that they were concerned that through the power of suggestion you could create an impenetrable witness for a court of law. That by hypnotizing somebody, you could induce them to tell a false story. That story would be impervious to cross-examination because the individual would sincerely believe in the truth of what he or she was saying. And therefore, you would never be able to effectively cross-examine that person because they would continually insist on the truth of what they were reporting. And so in by the early 1890s, the phenomenon of false memory had already been noted and been written about extensively, and its application to courts of law had already been written about. There is absolutely nothing new in the false memory issue. It is simply a failure to read the literature from 100 years ago. What's more important is, where are we going to go from now with false memory? And I think the answer is where we have already come from 100 years ago. The next step beyond false memory was the beginning to use these techniques deliberately for the purpose of mind control. And essentially the first steps are taken by A.R. Luria in his institute in Moscow. And Luria reasoned that if you can get people to have false confessions with hypnosis, you probably could build affective complexes on those false confessions. In other words, you could not only get people to report things that never happened, you could get them to experience the entire range of emotions affiliated with those events. And so Luria and his colleagues in Moscow in the 1920s began doing research on developing neuroses built upon the implantation of false memories. That work was replicated in the 1930s by Milton Erickson, Lawrence Kuby, and others who verified the truth of what Luria was reporting. Now, Luria's work was not merely academic. It had its operational uses in the next decade in the Moscow show trials, which are an extremely important historical event for our purposes. During the Moscow show trials, Stalin purged his old enemies. Now, one way you can do that is simply have them disappear, or you could have public executions. It is generally true throughout histories that regimes try to improve their own legitimacy by discrediting their predecessors. Stalin's way of doing it was to put on trial all his former friends. And what was different about the Moscow show trials is that when these defendants went on trial, they not only confessed to a series of crimes and sins they could not possibly have committed, but they begged to be shot as enemies of the state. Some recent books on the prosecutor's role in programming during the Moscow show trials have added some new information to our understanding of them. It was at this point that American intelligence agencies began to take notice of the mind control potential that seemed to be apparent from the Moscow show trials. The actual paper record, though, is hard to trace from the 1930s, easier to trace from the 1940s. And the trial that ultimately set the CIA off on its investigation of mind control was the trial of Cardinal Mindszenty. Mindszenty was a staunch anti-communist who was then arrested by the communists and put in the Andrassy Street prison in Hungary. 6 months later, he was put on trial, and as his predecessors a decade before, he confessed to crimes and sins that could not possibly have been true. These are a series of slides showing him at trial. The experience of Mindszenty was so frightening to American intelligence agencies that they began to investigate whether or not the Soviets possessed some new form of mind control unknown to the West. And here, two stories developed that are both true and completely contradictory. In secret CIA files, you will find both of these stories validated. On the one hand, the CIA argued that it was afraid that it was losing the war for control of the mind, and that the Soviets had developed this new sophisticated psychology or whatever to control the way people think and act, and America had to catch up. We were on the defensive now, and we had to, a lot of work that had to be done. On the other hand, in a document that was extremely highly classified, eyes only, for the director of the CIA's eyes only, it turned out that there was a spy in the Andrassy Street prison who was reporting back to the CIA everything that was happening to Mindszenty. And this eyes-only report, which I've read, is a wonderful document. It details exactly what happened to Mindszenty. It names the Soviet hypnotists who did the work and the drugs that they used to assist them in that work. It's a step-by-step manual for the programming of Mindszenty. And what's particularly interesting is if you read Cardinal Mindzenty's autobiography of the events, he really doesn't know what happened to him. And at this point, the CIA had a better knowledge of the programming of Mindszenty than he had of his own programming. And so on the one hand, the CIA knew everything that the Soviets were doing, yet on the other hand, they were reporting that they were afraid that they were losing the war. And I think both of those stories are true, though they're contradictory, and both are supported by secret CIA documents. Meanwhile, a related event begins to happen. In the late 1940s, Edward Hunter, in 1949, for the first time, coins the term brainwashing and writes a book on it. This is one of the two books that Hunter wrote. It turned out that Hunter was an OSS and then later CIA propagandist. And the word brainwashing was particularly useful because American prisoners of war were starting to give confessions of using germ warfare during the Korean War. And America needed a way of stopping that kind of propaganda. And the term brainwashing, which had been coined by Hunter to explain the thought reform program in communist China, proved a useful vehicle. This is Edward Hunter. I had I was able to do one of the last interviews with him before his death. In the deep literature on brainwashing, the more academic literature on brainwashing, his view of it is called the robot theory. The notion that with brainwashing techniques you can turn somebody into an automaton. The robot theory of brainwashing is not the only theory of brainwashing, but it is the most flamboyant, and it's also the most frightening. The idea of brainwashing then in the 1950s became the object of a lot of study and writing in books like In Every War But One. People who'd actually gone through the experience wrote about what had happened to them, and researchers like Biderman in books like this were reporting what happened to American prisoners of war and other prisoners of war. In Hawaii, an American camp was set up to be a mock prison of war camp to use the techniques that were being used of brainwashing. This is an illustration from that camp. These are actually all Americans, but it's a simulated exercise in brainwashing because Americans were searching for a way to inoculate our soldiers. If they should get captured and put through a brainwashing experience, would it have been possible for us to inoculate them previously so the brainwashing would not take? While the brainwashing studies were going on, another development was happening simultaneously important to the development of mind control, and these are the sensory deprivation experiments that began in Canada with Donald Hebb and others. Hebb's original work was essentially on what's called highway trance, the phenomena that people who will drive on highways in long stretches of road that's pretty monotonous will go into trance. And this is a form of sensory deprivation. If it's dark at night, there's a long road, there's no scenery. You probably all have had the experience of realizing you've suddenly driven a couple of miles but have no memory for that couple of miles passing, or you've gotten very drowsy. Well, the phenomenon of sensory deprivation became the subject of a good deal of study in the 1950s. What would happen to the mind if it were deprived of sensory input, since the mind needs sensory input the way the body needs food? And in a series of studies, this is on isolation. Inside the black rooms, students in universities across the country, in Canada and other places, were put in a black room. Here's an illustration of it. There's essentially almost no sensory input at all. What happens to the mind? Flotation tanks and other ways of decreasing sensory input all had the effect of causing the mind, when it is deprived of sensory input, to throw out a hallucinated world in order to get input back from that hallucinated world. And people, in fact, kept in isolation too long could become psychotic. Books studying the phenomena of isolation and also in conjunction with manipulating people's mind through techniques of brainwashing began to appear. The Brain Benders is one. The Battle for the Mind by William Sargent is the foremost British book on this subject. Robert J. Lifton's study, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, is the classic work on the Chinese thought reform program. Edgar Schein's book on coercive persuasion, on the Americans taken prisoner during the Korean War. Rape of the Mind by Mirlu, another classic. As all of this was happening, this was what you could call a form of coercive persuasion, as Schein had suggested. But there was another event that was occurring simultaneously. The 1950s is in many ways the birth of mind control experimentation, because you have the brainwashing issue, the hypnosis issues, the isolation and sensory deprivation studies, and you now get the next stream of research, which involves obedience to authority studies. I mentioned the other night Solomon Asch's studies on opinions and social pressure, and what Asch did at Yale was the simplest of experiments on conformity. He drew on a blackboard a line that was 1 foot long and another line directly under it, parallel to it, that was 2 feet long. He then got 6 or 7 people in a room, all of whom except one had been bribed. And the last one had no knowledge of the bribing of the others. He then asked them in order which one was the shorter line. And to the horror of the one who was not bribed, everyone reported that the 2-foot line was the shorter line. And it was visually obvious that that was untrue, but everybody else in the room was reporting it as true. And what Asch discovered was that the subject would report seeing the longer line as the shorter line, that he would conform to peer pressure. Cynics dismissed it on the grounds that it just showed the stupidity of Yale graduates, but that was not a sufficient scientific explanation. As Walter reported the other night, the experiments were done in the Navy and other places as well. Now, I want to distinguish this group of work from the others that I've just reported on. Here we're talking about a form of manipulation of the mind that does not involve physical coercion. In the brainwashing work, in the isolation work, there is a form of physical intimidation that involves taking over the body and controlling the body, controlling all of the input in the mind, and so forth. And so this is a person in that situation knows that he or she is in that situation, that they are captive in some way. With this kind of experimentation, we have what I call conversational persuasion. This is the beginning of the attempt to develop theories of social influence on freestanding populations where people are not aware that they are being held captive in any way, and indeed they're not. The next step along the lines of obedience research, and in some ways the most frightening, is the work done by Milgram and his book Obedience to Authority. If you're not familiar with Milgram's work, I'll give you a very brief explanation of it. Milgram wanted to test the hypothesis that people in Germany, good people in Germany, during the Nazi regime, were manipulated in a way to do evil, or let me restate that. Milgram wondered why so many good people in Nazi Germany could allow such evil to happen around them knowingly. And his thesis was not the idea that there's something inherent in the German character, but rather that there's something inherent in people. And he was interested in showing whether or not, if a Hitler-type character arose in the United States, that person would be able to get good people to do evil in this country. And so he built a box. I don't have a slide of it here. He built a box with 30 switches, just little light switches. And the 30 switches were in 15-volt increments. They were marked in 15-volt increments. As you moved over towards the right of the box, there began to be some writing which said caution, danger, extreme danger, and the last group of switches were marked in triple red X's. Now, he then put an advertisement, again, this is at Yale, so maybe the cynics are right. He put an advertisement in the local New Haven newspaper for people to volunteer for the experiment. People came in and they were told that the experiment involved pain and learning, and that they would be the teachers, and that there was a student and they could see the student. And the student, they were told, was hooked up to an electric grid. And every time the teacher was to give the student a question, and every time the student gave a wrong answer, one of the switches was to be pushed. When Milgram and his associates talked about the experiment, they concluded that nobody would push all the switches, And most people would stop pushing the switches about halfway through, because each switch was intended to deliver a higher voltage shock. The subject, as about half the switches were pulled, would increasingly flinch and then scream and then yell, would then say, I don't want to do this anymore, would then say, I have a heart condition, please stop, and then would refuse to answer any question and would slump over. If the teacher balked at pushing the next switch, there was an experimenter there in a long white laboratory coat with a clipboard and a pencil, who was instructed to say first continue, and then please continue, and then you must go on with the experiment, and finally I will take responsibility. And what Milgram discovered is that the overwhelming number of people pushed all of the switches, and that the simple reinforcement of saying I will take responsibility, or that there was an experiment going on, was sufficient to allow them to do that. Now, after Milgram's experiments were replicated in other places, what eventually evolved is that the horror of what he was proving was so ghastly that the scientific literature turned away from it and instead focused on the ethics of doing that kind of experiment. Because after all, what he was doing is taking people from the street and not telling them that they were what he was studying. They thought he was studying the subject. And a lot of these people, as you can imagine, had severe emotional reaction once they realized that they had shocked somebody with a heart condition on a machine that went beyond extreme danger to triple X's in red. And so the ethics of doing that kind of work then created a movement in universities and other places for institutional review boards, etc., and the research can't be done anymore. And what Milgram was proving, how easy it is to manipulate people by the simplest of commands, was no longer being studied, and certainly not in that manner. But books like Compliant Behavior, Beyond Obedience to Authority, were being written to increase and replicate and extend the work of Milgram. And here's a report called Conformity, Compliance, and Conversion from an Air Force in, I think, around the 1950s, an Air Force report using Milgram's work in Air Force conditioning. Give me a moment, take a break. I want to change the slides for the next carousel. Let's go back and talk some more about hypnosis, since it plays a central role in the rest of the development of mind control. Let me say that also, given the nature of the subject of mind control, there are a lot of things I'm not talking about. I'm not going to be talking to you about the physiological aspects of mind control to take you through the lobotomy and psychosurgery and electrical stimulation of the brain literature. And I won't be talking about the pharmacological aspects of mind control, the use of drugs and botanicals and chemicals for mind control. But that should give you an idea of how vast the subject is. We're just concentrating here on the psychological aspects of mind control. All right. The notion of hypnotic seduction had been noticed in the secret report to the king in France. It had been noticed by Freud in his work, and it had been noticed by many others. A series of slides on hypnotic seduction. The idea of hypnotic seduction got, I think, its greatest impetus in an 1894 book called Trilby. And this is an illustration from it with the infamous Svengali as the hypnotist. And to this day, the portrait of Svengali as a hypnotist is almost as powerful as Sherlock Holmes as a detective. It's almost the stereotype of the field. In Trilby, today would be a number one bestseller, the equivalent of a number one bestseller, and even bigger. It was probably the first blockbuster novel. It was published in a magazine in serial form, and after the first issue appeared, the magazine had to print an additional 100,000 copies because of the desire for people to continue the story. The author, George du Maurier, was launched into such public light that he ultimately hid from all, in order to preserve his privacy. He had lecture tours through the United States and Britain. You remember Peyton Place, how huge a novel that was at the time? This was the equivalent and even bigger. The story of Trilby is the story of a hypnotist who gets total control over the personality of a young woman. And the novel itself, I find to be incredibly boring. But the portrait of the hypnotist is tremendously exciting and has lived on almost as an icon of the subject itself. There was a town in Florida, and I haven't checked to see whether this is still true, that changed its name to Trilby. And in the center of town, they have Svengali Square. There were Trilby parties, Trilby hats, Trilby clothes. It was an enormously popular and influential novel, which introduced people to the idea of the potential for hypnotic seduction, and also even worse. Since I don't want to dwell on this aspect of mind control, let me sum it up and say that the traditional thinking has been that you cannot get people to do with hypnosis what they would not otherwise do. There is value in that thinking because it then doesn't encourage people to try. But if you go and talk to the hypnotist who will tell you that, and you talk to them in private, they will tell you the opposite story. That within certain parameters you can get people to do things they would otherwise not do with hypnosis, and that while their hypnosis is not a magic wand or a magic potion, it is an effective facilitator for seduction or antisocial conduct. There is an increase in court cases of hypnotic seduction now, but I want to turn to the more frightening prospect of using hypnosis for the creation of antisocial crimes. Can you get, you are in my power, you will do what I tell you. How far can you get control of somebody using hypnosis and forms of social influence? This has been the subject of a lot of fiction. Just from my library, here are some of the books. The Darker the Night, was the hypnotist the killer? Seeing is Believing. Your Eyelids Are Growing Heavy. Murder is Suggested. Telephone, which of course is a movie as well. And there are academic books like Hypnotism and Crime. Interestingly, there has been no major work on the antisocial aspects of hypnosis, either in the legal literature or in the psychiatric, hypnotic, or psychological literature for over 30 years. 1960 is the last time we have a full discussion of the issue of hypnotic coercion. And 1972 was the last time a hypnosis journal directed itself primarily to that issue. The texts suggest that there are cases in which people, through hypnosis, have been induced to commit crimes, but the hypnosis community has been divided as to whether those are pure cases. There is what I call the methodological dilemma that arises at this point. If you, usually the hypnotic encounter requires a certain amount of time and a certain amount of trust. And so hypnosis researchers argue that it's not hypnosis that facilitates either seduction or the production of antisocial acts. Rather, it is the relationship between the hypnotist and the subject, and therefore hypnosis is not at fault. The experimentalists discount any clinical anecdotal material because it's not rigorously scientific and therefore can't prove the conclusion of hypnotic coercion. But the experimental literature itself is discounted because, as Albert Moll wrote 100 years ago, and Martin Orne has written as well, at some level a subject always knows that he or she is participating in an experiment. And so there is no way to test the validity of the hypothesis that you can induce, through hypnosis, antisocial conduct. On the other hand, such conduct is produced on a regular basis, whatever the explanation. The one place where the studies were done where there was no fear of ethical violation or legal consequences was in work done by the Central Intelligence Agency. And since the work has never been fully published, I have an article that'll be coming out in the American Journal of Clinical Hypnosis on the CIA hypnosis experiments. It's not my function here to criticize the intelligence agencies or to condemn what they have done. I'm instead trying to argue the point that the hypnosis community in general, and psychologists and psychiatrists as well, need to know the data that was produced and which still exists in CIA files if we are going to be accused by the false memory people of using undue suggestion to get people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. We need to know the limits of those possibilities. And that material is in CIA files. Therapists are being sued across the country. They need access to that information to help defend themselves. And so it is in the spirit of science and in the spirit of protecting therapists and patients, for the good of the country, that I present this material so that we can hope that the full amount of it is ultimately revealed. I also must make a caveat. I can only report on information that I've seen either through my search of CIA files and my interviews with CIA hypnotists and other hypnotists. There may be mistakes in what I present. I cannot correct that unless I have access to all of the material. And so if I have made a mistake, it is a mistake that comes from not being given the material, because I have in good faith worked through the material I have to tell as accurate a story as I know how. The CIA began experimenting as soon as it was born in the late 1940s. The experimentation in mind and behavior control had already begun in the OSS with hypnosis experiments, truth serums, truth tablets, and lethal pills, as well as other kinds of experiments. But it was after the Cardinal Mindszenty episode that the CIA began to really become concerned about the possibility of hypnotic coercion. And let me quote to you from a CIA document at the time. This is a February 10th, 1951 CIA top-secret memo called Defense Against Soviet Medical Interrogation and Espionage Techniques. Quote, hypnotism has been reported to have been used in some cases by the Soviets as an adjunct to interrogation. It would be possible for a skilled Soviet operator to lower a prisoner's resistance to questioning and yet leave him with no specific recollections of having been interrogated. With respect to inducing specific action on the part of the subject by hypnotism, it would be possible to brief a prisoner or other individual, subsequently dispatch him on a mission, and successfully debrief him on his return without his recollection of the whole proceeding. A June 1951 CIA memo says, quote, CIA interest is in the specific subject of devising scientific methods for controlling the minds of individuals, unquote. And so by in the late 1940s, some essentially uncontrolled experimentation was begun by various people within the CIA, and a more structured program was also undertaken which had the name Bluebird, and that name was then changed to Artichoke. And under projects Bluebird and Artichoke, the attempt was made to bring together all known knowledge of interrogation techniques, truth serums, polygraphs, and hypnosis to create essentially an elite interrogation team with facility in all of those endeavors, and have them do the work that would be needed, first of all, to protect against infiltration by enemy agents, and also to protect the minds of American agents who might get captured by communist individuals. In the early 1950s, Walter Smith, the director of Central Intelligence, in an eyes-only memo, said he wanted to know, he issued an order that he wanted an answer to the question, quote, whether effective practical techniques exist whereby an individual can be caused to become subservient to an imposed control and subsequently that individual be unaware of the event, unquote. And so the purpose of the CIA experiments by the early 1950s was to discover the ways to control the minds of individuals. And Bluebird and Artichoke were one part of it. There were other parts as well. The CIA's facility in Langley did not exist at that time. They used office buildings throughout the Washington area and safe houses around the country and throughout the world. Eventually, in 1953, we get a new program from the CIA, which is the most expansive mind control program in the history of the world. Its genesis begins in 1953 with a speech given by Allen Dulles, who was the new CIA director. In his speech, Dulles said that we were losing control of the battle of the mind, that we were at war with the Soviet Union. He called it brain warfare, and the Soviets possessed knowledge which the United States did not. A memo 2 months later, in June 1953, a top secret memo states, quote, interrogations of the individuals who had come out of North Korea across the Soviet Union to freedom recently had apparently experienced a blank period or a period of disorientation while passing through a special zone in Manchuria. By 1953, in other words, that the notion of the Manchurian candidate, almost in those exact terms, had been theorized by the CIA. I'll come back to that point in a moment. But in Dulles' public speech in April 10th, 1953, to Princeton alumni in Hot Springs, West Virginia, he argued that we had to do something to make sure we did not lose the war with the Soviet Union. And about a week and a half later, he signed into law what was called MK Ultra, all capital letters. Walter has speculated, and I think it's a good speculation, that the MK stands for mind control, and Ultra was the code name given to breaking the Japanese and German codes, and so this was the code name given to breaking the code of the human mind. MK Ultra was 149 sub-projects. It was the umbrella for 149 sub-projects, all of them under the auspices of Sidney Gottlieb, and later directed by his boss, Richard Helms. The 149 sub-projects, you can read something about this in government documents. This is a project MK Ultra from a joint hearing of, I think it's the United States Senate. And so the material, some of the material has been made public by the Congress. Other material has not been made public. But the existence of MK Ultra is not a secret, and its contours are known to some extent. The purpose, another government document, also explores some of the same territory. This one is on biomedical research, biomedical and behavioral research by the government. The goal of all 149 sub-projects was mind and behavior control. Some of them involved botanical, some of them involved things like psychosurgery and electrical stimulation of the brain. 9 of the sub-projects involved hypnosis. Some of the sub-projects involved things like voodoo. One of them involved circumcision to create anxiety and then manipulate the anxiety. And almost anything you could think of and things you wouldn't think of as ways to control the mind were funded and studied. Maybe one of the more well-known studies and one of the most notorious now is the work that was done by Ewan Cameron in Canada. Cameron was the president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and the World Psychiatric Association. And in his work in the 60s at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, he had a theory that sounds unique, but actually exists in Brave New World Revisited, and even goes back to the ancient Greeks. His notion was that you could completely erase a personality by regressing an individual back to an infantile state. A process he called depatterning, and then you could program that individual with a new personality, a process he called psychic driving. In order to destroy the original personality, Cameron put his subjects to sleep for up to 2 months, injected them with LSD, mescaline, and other psychoactive chemicals, and essentially engaged in a form of regression therapy. Age regression may be a hypnotic phenomenon, but this was, in a sense, an actual regression. This was the attempt to manipulate people back to a state of infantilism. When was this? These were the 1960s. Yeah. These were people who came to him because they were depressed, or because they were, in other words, this was the local psychiatric institute, and you went there if you needed help. Let me continue, because I've got a lot more to cover. I'll take questions after. One of the people who came to him, I don't have a slide of her, but I've done some TV shows with her, was the wife of a member of the Canadian Parliament. Val Olikoff was her name. She's dead now. And Val had just had a baby, and she was suffering, I think, from postpartum depression. Listless, didn't feel she was able to care for her baby or for herself, and in general she was feeling unequal to the task of wifehood and motherhood. And her husband suggested that maybe she could benefit from some psychiatric care, and she thought that was a good idea, and they made the mistake of winding up going to Ewan Cameron. And Cameron destroyed her life, and she, along with, I think, 10 or 11 other people, ultimately sued the Canadian government and the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA contributed funding to Ewan Cameron's experiments. There was 60 Minutes did a story on this that I show at meetings from time to time. One of the people went there because he was feeling badly, and he went through the same kind of process, and they later discovered that he had a minor skin disease, and a single shot of cortisone would have cured him. But his life was ruined, and as he put it, he said, "Where do I go for help? I don't trust any psychiatrist or psychologist or therapist anymore after what they did for me, and I know I need their help, and yet I've been programmed to not trust them. And so where do I go for relief?" The experiments have been written about in detail In a number of books, this is the least reliable, Gordon Thomas's Journey into Madness. Harder to find. A Canadian book, I Swear by Apollo, is more accurate. Perhaps the best of the books is Ann Collins' In the Sleep Room. And in some ways the most compelling and the most, I wouldn't want to say important, but the one most emotional perhaps is Harvey Weinstein's book. This is the Canadian edition, A Father, a Son in the CIA, and it's slightly revised and printed by the American Psychiatric Press here. Can you lower that? It's so that we can see the title. Is there somebody? No. Okay. I don't have the title here. It's something like Psychiatry in the CIA. Okay. Harvey's father was one of those people who was depressed and went into the Allen Memorial Institute and as a human being and came out as a vegetable. He never did become a whole human being again, and indeed it was what happened to his father that led Harvey into psychiatry. And Harvey's conclusion is something that should be read, I think, by everybody in the mental health field. After all of the knowledge of the CIA experiments and the Army experiments and Air Force and Navy experiments have come out, after all of what we know, not a single researcher has been subjected to a single lawsuit or even censure by a professional organization for work that was clearly illegal and clearly unethical, even at the time. And the message must be, if there are no consequences to doing these kinds of work, the work will continue. And indeed, that's certainly most likely what has happened. And so Harvey's conclusion is that if the professional organizations are not going to step up and condemn this kind of experimentation, then it will be repeated and other generations will suffer the horror that his family suffered. Now, Cameron's experiment was a simply, part of the series of brainwashing tests to regress people back to this infantile state. Now, the Greeks had Greek sleep temples that had a similar focus, but modern technology added to Cameron's work, he used a tape loop. He would interview an individual. You've heard about Erickson's power words and whatever. He would find words that were important to his patients, and he would program those words in messages that he would construct on tape loops that would be played into their brain a million times to a million to a million and a half times. And so, in fact, these people were quite literally programmed. In a state of infantilism, Cameron wrote that they could endure sensory deprivation indefinitely. Whereas most people would crack by about 8 hours, these people could stay there indefinitely. The psychic driving in which the tape loops were used was the attempt to reconstruct a personality. And I wondered where such a fiendish idea would have come from. And I found it in a 1951 science fiction novel called The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. And if you are a science fiction buff, I certainly urge you to find that book and read it. Basically, the theory of the novel is that when somebody commits a crime, that shows a certain boldness that society should appreciate, but it's in the wrong direction. And so what they do is they take criminals to the hospital and they regress them back to infantilism, and then they rebuild a new personality. Exactly the idea that Cameron was working on with his subjects, had been written about a few years before he began as a science fiction novel. I won't ever know whether he had read that novel because Cameron is dead now, but the studies from his work showed that it did not work, and indeed it caused a great deal of pain to a great number of people. Okay, let's move on because time is moving on. The idea of manipulating people with hypnosis in ways that are effective and in ways that are quite bizarre, it was born in the brain of George Estabrook, seen here. Estabrook's very interesting character was working in Morton Prince's laboratories at Harvard in the 1920s, and he had the idea that if you could cure a multiple personality with hypnosis, maybe you could create one with hypnosis. Well, why in the world would anybody want to create a multiple personality? Well, Estabrook had the solution. You could create then a super spy, or indeed a super assassin, somebody who would do the bidding of his country and have no knowledge that he was engaged in those acts. Estabrook said in 1928 that my views are here somewhat different from most psychologists. I believe the hypnotist's power to be unlimited, or rather to be limited only by his intelligence and his scruples. And so in the 1920s, he went around trying to convince the military to create hypnotically programmed individuals, create a multiple personality, and use that one as a courier. They thought he was crazy and ignored him until the Moscow show trials. And then they took him seriously, and in the archives of his work at Colgate, there's a notation that he stopped publishing in the mid-1930s because his work had then become classified. If you read his book, this is the Morton Prince's Dissociation of the Personality, the classic work, beginning works on multiple personality. If you read Estabrook's book, Hypnotism, through its various editions, what you discover is that each edition is more assertive about the validity of creating hypnotically programmed couriers. And finally, in an interview he gave in a local Rhode Island newspaper in 1963, he claims that this is not science fiction, it is fact, I have done it. Working for the FBI and the CIA, that he would create a multiple personality, program that personality to be a courier, send that personality somewhere in the world, and then have them return and have them be amnesic for all of that. Now, the idea may have originated with Estabrook, but he may not have been the first to actually publish it as such. Writing in the Psychoanalytic Review of 1947, Major Harry Levitt of the U.S. Army Medical Corps described the hypnotic creation of a secondary personality. Quote, hypnotically induced automatic writing was established early in the course of treatment as a means of expeditiously gaining access to unconscious material. After this procedure was utilized for a time, a hypnotic secondary personality was produced by suggesting that the writing was under the control of a certain part of his personality unaware to him. Levitt then said that he created another personality in direct contrast to the one already established, so he could work the two created personalities off against one another. He concluded, again, quote, regardless of whether the production of multiple personalities by means of hypnosis could be construed as additional proof that hypnosis is an artificially induced hysteria, or whether the multiple personalities were artificial entities resulting from direct suggestions, there exists a close relationship to personalities spontaneously arising in hysterical dissociation. The importance of producing multiple personalities experimentally lies in the fact that certain elements of the original personality may be isolated, which manifest a minimum of censorship influences and thus may serve as helpful adjuncts in hypnoanalysis. Well, that was not the purpose for the intelligence agencies in working with the idea of creating a multiple personality. The story of the intelligence agencies creating multiple personalities to use as couriers and assassins may have begun with Esther Brooks, and indeed in CIA documents, I think you can see Esther Brooks's theories worked out and discussed. But the genesis of the work begins in 1951 in the CIA Office of Security, where an official named Morse Allen got the idea that CIA agents should be trained in hypnosis, and in order to train them in hypnosis, he arranged for them to go up to New York and get training from a stage hypnotist. As soon as he and the agents got to New York, the stage hypnotist spent an hour and a half with them, regaling them with tales of hypnotic seduction, of how when the hypnotist went on the road, he would sleep with a different woman each night. Some of them he would give hypnotic hallucinations that he was their husband. Others he'd use other techniques, but that this was a technique that he found very productive for his own sexual favors. The CIA, of course, was delighted to hear all of this and reported so in the documents. If you could use the technique to manipulate people that way, this is what they wanted to learn, and so that's how they got trained. Then from 2,000 to 3,000 pages of documentation going from 1951 to 1954, the Morse Allen and his group replicated all of the known hypnosis experiments involving people putting their hands in acid or in jars of snakes and in shooting people, daggers, all of those experiments that the French and Germans and American researchers had conducted. Esther Brooks and others had conducted. Morse Allen and his group replicated. But they wanted to go further and explore the possibility of using hypnosis to create a programmed courier and a programmed assassin. The multiple personality idea itself may have come from Jekyll and Hyde, which was very popular at the time. Another illustration of that idea, in which two entirely different people can live within the same body, one being the embodiment of good, the other the embodiment of evil. It was good fiction, but it also was part of the genesis from Morton Prince's work. An Italian depiction of multiple personality. It's cut off at the top, but you can see the two faces pointing in other directions. By the 1950s, the popular press was reporting in the Three Faces of Eve the existence of multiple personality. The three faces, of course, were more than three faces, and the final face was not the final face. I'm Eve was Chris Sizemore finally telling the story with her real name, and then telling it again, A Mind of My Own. Well, her mind may be her own, but her life isn't. She's now suing the film company, which claims that did the movie The Three Faces of Eve. They claim they own the story of her life. She claims they own it only up to the time that she had three faces, and that the other faces still belong to her. So she's still not in control of her identity, and the fight goes on. Here she is in person. Sybil was then the next known, or highly reported case of multiple personality disorder. Herb Spiegel tells me that Sybil was not a multiple, and that when he treated her in Cornelia Wilbur's absence, that Sybil never had any need to express any other personalities with Herb. Herb admits she was brilliant and also extremely mentally ill, but that she was not a multiple, and that he refused to participate in the writing or publishing of the book if that was the spin they were going to take on her case. On the other hand, Herb he believes that multiples exist, but that the condition is extraordinarily rare, and so people have argued that she was smart enough to know he wouldn't believe it, and therefore smart enough to conceal the personalities from him, so the debate goes on. The use of hypnosis to create multiple personalities and in general for intelligence purposes appears in a number of confidential secret documents, just a few of which I'll throw up on the screen. Some stories have leaked out how the CIA hid it. How they hid it, they didn't tell anybody about it, very simple. The CIA explodes the old theory of hypnotic moral curb. They came to the conclusion that people can be induced to do things that would violate their moral codes, and that the folklore you can't get people to do things against their will was simply untrue. And they carried those experiments further to study ways to create unwitting killers. CIA documents tell of a 1954 project to create involuntary assassins. This is the end product of Morse Allen's work. Herb theory, he had replicated all of the experiments on hypnotic coercion and had conducted other experiments on his own, but all of these were in fact laboratory-type experiments. He wanted to do more. He wanted to see whether operational use could be put to these principles. And so his group prepared a film called The Black Art. In the film, a, quote, Oriental character, unquote, is having a drink with an American agent. A drug is surreptitiously placed in the drink that causes the Oriental man to fall asleep. While dozing, he's hypnotized and programmed. The CIA had already experimented on hypnotizing people in sleep conditions. The next scene shows the Oriental man opening a safe containing secret files. He removes the files and then brings them to an American agent who reinforces the hypnotic suggestion. At this point, there's a voiceover by a narrator who asks, could what you have seen been accomplished without the individual's knowledge? Yes. Against the individual's will? Yes. With complete amnesia of performing the act? Yes. How? Through the powers of suggestion and hypnosis. Again, by 1954, Morse Allen was pushing hard to have operational tests of the thesis that you could construct a multiple personality and have that personality commit crimes, come back, and have no knowledge in the host that that act had been committed. In other words, the Manchurian Candidate scenario had been worked out by the CIA 5 years before the novel was published. But would it work? In order to know whether it worked, you had to conduct what Morse Allen called terminal experiments. These were experiments that could result in the death of the subject. The CIA gave clearance for those experiments to be done, and in reference to one researcher who was asked if he would participate in them, he said, if you'd set up terminal experiments, I'll do them for free. By 1954, the literature demonstrates that Morse Allen's concerns had reached the higher levels of the CIA, and that they were willing to engage in a field test for the Manchurian Candidate type scenario. A January 1954 artichoke memo says, quote, could an individual of a certain descent be made to perform an act of attempted assassination involuntarily under the influence of artichoke, unquote. And then later in the memo it says, as a trigger mechanism for an even bigger project, the CIA proposed, quote, that an individual of a certain descent, approximately 35 years old, well-educated, proficient in English, and well-established socially and politically in a foreign government, be induced under artichoke to perform an act involuntarily of attempted assassination against a prominent foreign politician, or, if necessary, against an American official, unquote. Now, it was clear then by summer of 1954 that the artichoke team said we can create an artificial personality, program that personality to conduct an assassination. That assassination would occur. If, in fact, the individual was captured, he would never reveal the knowledge that he had engaged in the assassination because the host would know nothing about the altar. The amnesia barrier would be impenetrable, and even under torture, the host would not reveal the secrets. CIA research in many universities around the country explored topics such as programming people by way of telephone, whether somebody could be answer a telephone, a secret word would be given, they would slip automatically into a trance, nobody around them would know they were in trance, they wouldn't know they were in trance, and so forth. Experiments on pain, experiments on creating unconscious recorders, experiments were done on whether people would commit suicide under hypnotic instructions and so on. Albert Moll had written 100 years ago that it would be possible to give people hypnotic instructions to have them commit suicide. These were the subjects of CIA experiments. What ultimately happened, we don't know because the government files closed up at the point of reporting on the assassination attempts, but a year later, a May 1955 top-secret report called Hypnotism and Covert Operations begins with the following paragraph. Frankly, I now mistrust much of what is written by academic experts on hypnotism. Partly this is because many of them appear to have generalized from a very few cases, and partly because much of their cautious pessimism is contradicted by agency experimenters. But more particularly because I have personally witnessed behavior responses which respected experts have said are impossible to obtain, unquote. And so by 1954, the Manchurian Candidate scenario had already been thought of and was already under operational testing. This is Richard Condon, who wrote The Manchurian Candidate. As Walter discovered when Walter wrote him, he had no idea that he was writing fact. He thought he was writing fiction. The only case that has come out of the literature that suggests someone who may have been an experimental subject is the control of Candy Jones. Candy was quite a beautiful woman, second only to Betty Grable as a pinup girl during World War II. But her artificial personality, Arlene Grant, was programmed by the CIA, according to the book, to be a hypnotic courier, and she was sent around the world and occasionally captured and tortured. Her last instruction was to have a 2-week vacation in Bermuda and then jump off a cliff. It did not happen because her husband, John Nebel, who was a very famous all-night disc jockey in New York, and an amateur hypnotist, shortly after they were married, began to feel that he had actually married 2 different women and could not account for the mood swings and the differences in personality. Using hypnosis with her, this story unraveled. Candy was sent to Herb Spiegel for evaluation. Herb did a workup on her using the hypnotic induction profile and other tests and found she was very, very high hypnotizable. And while he couldn't conclude that what she was saying was true, he could conclude that it would be true of her if it were true. In other words, she is the kind of person that this manipulation would have worked with. And so the Candy Jones story, which we cannot validate and we cannot invalidate. I've seen a CIA file marked Grant, but I've not been able to get its contents. It may be true, it may not be true. But the story about hypnotically programming couriers and assassins clearly is true. And that book was published before the CIA documents were made available. All of this, of course, violates the Nuremberg standards, but those standards have had no application in covert activities. We found a document from the Attorney General of the United States from the Attorney General of the United States to the Director of Central Intelligence, which said that if any of your agents are caught during their work, they will not be prosecuted for crimes. And therefore, there is essentially the 007 license to kill, that CIA agents will not be prosecuted for their crimes. Therefore, the Nuremberg standards do not apply. It wasn't until the Nelson Rockefeller report to the president in June 1975 that we had any inklings about this material. and then basically a paragraph or maybe even just a sentence mentioning mind and behavior control sent researchers looking for the files, and in his testimony before Congress, Stansfield Turner corroborated the existence of the mind control programs. Some people wrote about them at the time. Peter Watson's book from England, The Military Uses and Abuses of Psychology, touch on but do not give in any detail the experiments done by the CIA and Army, but do talk in general about the use of psychology for military purposes. The classic works, of course, are Walter's book, Operation Mind Control, which is hard to find, and a collector's item, an extremely important book. John Marks's book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, and my book, The Mind Manipulators. All three of them, these were the only three books to appear on the subject of mind and behavior control by the CIA and Army experimental programs. I want to move the story forward some more from the CIA experiments in the 1950s into the 1960s and beyond. The 1960s brought us a new variation, and that is the operational utilization of the techniques of brainwashing and sensory deprivation and so forth that had been explored in the 1940s and especially in the 1950s. And this is the religious cult issue. This is Steve Hassan's book, Combating Cult Mind Control. There's a revised edition available for sale, probably the best of the deprogramming books on mind control. But it was in the 1960s that the idea of using these techniques on essentially freestanding populations was experimented with, and the cults provide the laboratory setting for social influence processes where the people are not taken into a complete physical custody. And so the cults themselves represent, I think, the step from the laboratory experiments into the real world operational use. And then beyond them, books like Mind Bending on Cult Deprogramming. Beyond them, we move into the books on Satanism and on programming. This one, I think, is available for sale there. There are a couple more. This one may also be available for sale. Satan's Children, linking the multiple personality issue with Satanism. Can we prove this? Where do we stand with our knowledge of Satanism? Well, speaking as a lawyer, it's going to be very rough going to prove a widespread intergenerational network of satanic cults in court. Part of the reason for that is the report issued, in Pursuit of Satan, by Ken Lanning, who has concluded that though instances of satanic abuse do exist, there is no evidence to support intergenerational, widespread, multinational networks of satanic abuse. Also, within the next 2 months, the most major study in the country on this issue will reach the same conclusions as Ken Lanning, and that report is due in about 2 months. But the tentative conclusion, which will be the final conclusion, is that Lanning's perception is correct, and that the evidence does not exist for intergenerational. Now, the methodology can be challenged, and in any event, the question of whether therapists who work with people who claim to be abused in satanic cults should be sued is a separate issue from what can be proven. Is it reasonable for you to believe that widespread satanic abuse occurs? And the answer, I think, to that is yes. Despite the Lanning report and despite the conclusion that will come out later on, it is your job to believe your patients. at least within the therapy setting. And if they say it happened, then you work effectively with them by believing it happened. It's when there's a real-world corollary that the trouble begins. And so using my lawyer hat now, do not tell your patients to go out and sue their fathers or sue other people. Do not tell them to give newspaper accounts and so on. And to protect yourself in your clinical notes, say that this is the story your patient told. You have no way of knowing whether it's true or not, and in any event, that's not your function. Your function is to make the person whole with whatever material they present to you. As long as you do not advise that they go out and sue other people, you can advise them to seek legal help. If they say, should I sue? Should I sue? Should I sue? You say, that's not my job. I'm not a lawyer. You should go to a lawyer and see what the lawyer says. I will support you in this session, whatever you decide to do. But what you decide to do in the outside world is a decision that must be made by you and other professionals, not by me. As long as you do that, there should be no legal liability. If your patient sues you for believing all the crap that you're being told, in your notes somewhere should be, it's not my job to evaluate the historical validity of this information. But I will work with it as if it's true, because for my client at this point in time it is true. And that should protect you. All right, let's move on. Again, there are isolated instances. There are also a large accumulation of information from local police departments who are not as influenceable as the FBI. And the FBI did deny the existence of the mafia. And when I went to an FBI friend of mine who oversees the behavioral science program there, I said, why does the FBI deny the existence of widespread Satanism and so on? And he looked at me and said they also denied the existence of the mafia. And so their conclusions can be rebutted in part by a lot of data from local police that have found ritualistic killings. The book Mortal Remains is an illustration of a case in Massachusetts where the bones were found, where a satanic cult was practicing ritual murder. And so there are instances in which it can be proven. The existence of Satanism is provable for over many centuries, and the existence of cults and mind control programming is provable beyond question. And so for therapists to believe that there are some cults that are satanic is true. To believe that those satanic cults, may be more widespread than we have thought beforehand is reasonable. To believe that they engage in a bunch of horrendous practices. Look what the Nazi experimenters did, and look what you and Cameron did. And how can you say there's a limit on human depravity? And so it's not unreasonable to believe that these kinds of things can occur. And in any event, when you work with trauma, you work more effectively by believing the story that it has come from. Okay. Let's go further. In breaking bodies and minds, the role of psychiatric abuse and mental health professionals in creating torture victims and mind control victims is discussed. The complicity between torturers and professionals who help in the torture has been documented. This is the Irving Janis report in 1949 that validated the use of hypnosis as part of the conditioning techniques being used by the Soviets. A Rand report in 1958 again reaches the same conclusions, the involvement of hypnosis in brainwashing and other forms of programming. The book Why Men Confess is written by a former Assistant Attorney General of the United States, traces modern mind control back to the Malleus Maleficarum through the Moscow show trials and other places. It's a good, legitimate source for understanding the modern false memory stuff, which I'll get to right now. There has been only one completely litigated case involving false memory. Can you implant false memories? Of course. We knew that 100 years ago. And we've come a long way since then, as you can see in this talk. This is Eileen Franklin and her daughter. Her case is the only criminal case which has gone to trial, in which repressed memory played a major role. She claimed that her father killed her friend Susan Nason, who's up on the top. And that's her daughter on the bottom. Look how much alike they are. The story that Eileen Franklin tells is that she was looking into her daughter's eyes one day, and suddenly the image of watching her father kill her friend Susan, when Susan was 8 years old, 20 years earlier, came into her mind, and then the memory started to flood back of that experience. This is her father when he was arrested. Take a good look at him. Here he is at trial on the right. You learn a lesson about lawyering. That's his lawyer on the left. You clean up the client. You don't bring him into court looking like that. No, he looks like that on the right. Now, yeah, you can introduce the pictures, but it's not as powerful as the present appearance. Now, the Franklin case is a very troubling one, and we have to be honest about that, because we are first and foremost scientists, and unlike the false memory, we do not need to have a political agenda here. Eileen Franklin is a liar. She told 4 different stories about the genesis of her memory, one of which was that she was hypnotized in therapy. If that story were true, she would have been disqualified as a witness in California courts. When she learned that, or we hypothesized that when she learned that, she went back to her brother and she said, you know, I told you I've been hypnotized. Forget I said that. That's tampering with evidence. And so she told actually 4 different stories about how she recovered her memory, and that's grounds to disbelieve her, because there is clear evidence of lying in the way in which she presented herself. On the other hand, the fact that she's a liar does not mean that the story she told is false. The false memory people make that assumption, and that's bad logic. They may be right that she's a liar and her story is false, but you cannot make that jump as a logical matter. On the other hand, her father is my first knowledge of the case, real knowledge, came from a cab ride with Beth Loftus on my back. Each of them in the cab in my presence concluded that if her story were true, and that it might be true, it would have been true of this man. This man physically abused his son and sexually molested his daughters. He had a violent past. It's well documented. When he was arrested, he had a large collection of child pornography. He had an active correspondence with women to have sexual relations with their 7- and 8-year-old daughters. He had pictures of those activities involving him. Her memories may be true or may not be true. He is the kind of person they would be true of. There was independent physical corroboration, in other words, of his pedophilia, of his violence, and of the fact that this is the kind of man who would have committed that sadistic molesting and murder. It's up to the jury then to decide whether that evidence is enough. But her repressed memory was not the only basis of the testimony. The defense argued that everything that she remembered was available in a newspaper somewhere. She had no independent memories apart from anything that was in a newspaper. And that point was made to the jury. The jury convicted, and Franklin the father is now in jail for life. The California courts have rejected his appeal, and his lawyers have filed a motion in federal district court They have imported Richard Offshee, a specialist in social influence, to work over the mother who testified against him at trial, and she has now changed her mind. Of course, this is not an unusual phenomenon. Now that he's in jail and she could have recriminations, she might have changed her mind anyway, but the introduction of a social influence specialist with a political agenda to spend a lot of time with her, to reach a certain conclusion, it seems to me is a point, if there is a new trial, that will be raised at that new trial. What I found very interesting is I interviewed the lawyer, his lawyer, the prosecutor, and his appellate lawyer. And in their brief on appeal, the appellate lawyers wrote that no responsible person would believe that the concept of robust repression is false. In other words, the Offshee-Singer hypothesis that you cannot forget traumatic events over a sustained period of time, and that it's the, quote, scientific quackery of the 20th century, unquote, is, in the opinion of these lawyers, irresponsible thinking. And I agree. The evidence shows that the Offshee-Singer hypothesis is wrong. The evidence comes from biological studies of memory and how the brain processes traumatic memories differently than normal memories. And that also explains why Loftus's research on normal memory is irrelevant to the issue of traumatic memory, a point that she is now reluctantly starting to recognize. Is Eileen Franklin at trial? Is Freud dead? If you knock out the notion of robust repression, as the false memory people have been trying to do, you have a very simplistic idea. If a person can be repeatedly traumatized as a child, have no adult recollection of that trauma, go into therapy and then have a recollection, then the therapist must have implanted it if robust repression is not real. And so the existence of robust repression as the underpinning of the scientific foundation for the false memory argument is quite crucial. But that argument is now shown to be scientifically invalid, which doesn't mean that the false memory position is wrong. They are right about what therapists have been doing and shouldn't be doing, the misuse of social influence procedures. But they're wrong about the issue of robust repression. That means that somebody can go to a therapist and have that memory refreshed, and that memory can be true, which makes it a harder case. The world is no longer black and white. You cannot use the iatrogenic cause argument in every case of robust repression. The Father Porter cases are an illustration of robust repression, memories that were recovered without hypnotic intervention and in the absence of a therapeutic encounter. You may know the Father Porter story. My time is short, so I can't go through it with you now. But in any event, he recovered the memories of having been molested. He was able to validate those memories as to himself, and Father Porter is now in jail having confessed to having molested between 50 and 100 young boys and girls. And so in the search for the unraveling of the human mind, mind control is real. It has a rich history. I've only given you a fraction of the history. We haven't touched, as I said, on the physiological or pharmacological aspects. We haven't talked about behavior modification and conditioning techniques and so forth.
Well, I want to thank the speakers. I also have, those of you who know me know I'm going to have 2 cents to add. So some of you may be wondering, though, at this point, okay, mind control, what does that have to do with cults? Since that word is associated with the topic for this conference, I wonder how many people out there think that there are groups, cults, whatever, where they practice, let's say, harmful, deviant, black magic, Satanism, not witchcraft in the sense of Wicca, but dark arts, so to speak. I wonder how many people think that. The FMS will get you. Okay. Well, we are going to talk about that as well. And some of you might be wondering, what is the connection between cults, witchcraft, Satanism, so on, and the mind control that you're going to be hearing a great deal about from the finest experts on that subject here. And that's an important point. And I'm hoping that if we accomplish one thing in this conference, it is that we get a clear sense about what is the connection, because there is a connection. First of all, when we think about what people are calling satanic cults, many of you are aware that the false memory syndrome folks are arguing this is entirely a fantasy concept. You know, it has no basis in reality, that people stay up too late and watch late night TV, and they go see a therapist who's fanatical. And I had such a patient. Actually, I've seen about 200. This is a garment. This is a garment that her false memories conjured up in her attic. I'm not sure how her false memories did it, but here it is. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this robe because it has an interesting story associated with it. It was brought to me by a patient who found it in her residence. She dissociated and was able to explain what it meant and what it was about, but in her waking normal state, she was shocked and horrified that she found this in her residence. She didn't, in fact, there was a part of the garment that she didn't even know what it was. And we'll be talking more about that later. It was found in a box with roses, dried roses, very old, and a newspaper that's 20 years old that apparently was just used for packing purposes. So it's amazing what these false memories can produce out of nothing. But anyway, we need to start thinking about what is the common thread that goes through all this. And actually, there is a common thread, and it goes back even further historically than Satanism, or what people call Satanism. I qualify that because I don't believe that everybody who puts on a black robe is a Satanist. I think there are times that fraternities do stunts like that. And in fact, I think our previous President Bush, wasn't he a member of a group called the Skull and Bones? And I think they put on things like this. Of course, that doesn't seem to disprove you all, but I'm trying my best. Anyway, maybe I should have taken a different kind of logic there. But actually, this is an old story. And it's a story of trauma. It's a story of slavery. It's a story of the complete annihilation of other human beings when you can get away with it. It's a very, very sad story and has a long history. We can hear about that story and read about it in old documents, such as the Bible. The Bible talks about children passing through the fire. It talks about horrible things happening. And, of course, many people may have just thought, well, that's kind of an interesting story, you know. What does it mean? What does it mean that Aztecs and that other Mesoamericans would flay people on an altar and consume their heart? What's that all about? Well, my argument is there's a thread that goes all through this. And if we want to go back in time, we can go all the way back to the worship of nature, shamanism, and so on. Trauma has always been viewed throughout history as a way of creating altered states of consciousness. Trauma, there are a variety of ways to create altered states of consciousness. Obviously, you can meditate, you can do hypnosis, you can listen to drums pounding and they'll kind of carry you off and you'll drift a little bit. But nothing really exciting happens. Nothing very impressive happens. It's my belief that many, many years ago, people learned that if you traumatize a person in a certain way, you can create the God that you worship. And so for that reason, many early religions, many very old religions included trauma in their worship. In fact, there's a book out, some of you may have seen it, it's called God is a Trauma. And it's particularly about some of the Gnostic traumatic practices that went back into ancient times. But we can carry this back even further than, say, the ancient times, ancient medieval times, back to, again, shamanism. Now, it's hard really to understand shamanism in detail now, the ancient version, because, again, many of these practices are pre-literate. We have no way to know exactly what people did. We just see these examples, for example, in the Mayan temples, and we know that these buildings were probably used for these purposes. But it's a little easier to understand it if we look into the shamanistic practices of modern times. For example, I wonder how many people here are familiar with the sun-gazing dance, or the sun dance, as it's called. Some of you are, okay. Well, this is still practiced in North America. Some of you may have seen the movie that came out some, I guess, 20 years ago, A Man Called Horse. And in the movie, I thought it was totally fictional, because I didn't think you could ever get anybody who would agree to be lifted up with hooks stuck in their pectoral muscles. I didn't figure a big line would establish with people waiting to do that. And I assumed it was totally fictional, but as it turns out, I was doing some reading on shamanism, and I read a modern day account, and I saw photographs of them doing the sun dance now, the sun gazing dance. And again, the idea is very simple. And I'll be talking about this more when I get into more programming in particular. To me, this is where programming begins, where people perhaps learned accidentally that the use of trauma and other kinds of ritual acts can produce dissociated states, can produce dissociated identities. That is, you can produce the deity. And many villages may have wanted to have their deity there, and it may have been a great honor for some child to go through these horrible procedures so that the village could have their deity right there with them. Well, through time, these practices passed through some changes, but not a whole lot. Many of you are probably aware of the mystery cults that existed around the Mediterranean during the ancient and up until the medieval times. Many of these involved traumatic rituals as well. And so now we have many people making allegations that some of the modern day remnants of these mystery cults, that is the fraternal organizations of modern times, engage in this kind of behavior as well. There are also many other pre-industrial cults. There's an excellent book by Oki, an African juju high priest, who writes about the traumatic ordeals that were used in his West African community on people, and he describes the dissociation that also occurs there. So these things are happening now. Now, some of you may wonder, though, okay, this makes sense, it's logical, and somewhere in there Satanism is a part, too. We hear so much about Satanism. Certainly, there must be some, I mean, where there's smoke, there's got to be something to that. So where's the connection with the U.S. government and other governments and CIA and military intelligence? I mean, doesn't this really sound awfully far-fetched? Well, we can go back to the Hellfire Clubs of England and Ireland in the 1700s, and we see a very clear connection there between governments, powerful members of governments, and bizarre, occult, or satanic, whatever you want to call it, dark kinds of activities. As many of you probably know, Ben Franklin was a visitor of the Hellfire Club in London, or outside of London. And additionally, the organization that was established in the outskirts of London was actually created by Sir Francis Dashwood, who shortly thereafter became the Chancellor of the Exchequer of Great Britain. In other words, he would be the equivalent of the Secretary of the Treasury We're talking about top-level government. He was a personal friend to George III. I mean, very high-level government-type individual. And this was an individual who was carrying on in his residence bizarre practices that included blasphemous religious acts, bizarre sexual acts, and so on. Well, this is where we see a rather obvious beginning connection between governments and bizarre occult and other kinds of procedures like that. Aleister Crowley is another individual where we see a very clear connection between occultism, possibly Satanism, and governments. Crowley, of course, was involved with the British intelligence, as many of you know. And from then, we have this marriage made in hell, so to speak. In any case, there is a clear connection between the use of trauma in a ritualized manner and the development of dissociated individuals, the individuals that are coming forth that we're seeing nowadays clinically. And hopefully, I'm hoping that in this particular conference, we'll be able to show that connection, how it is, how it works, and hopefully give an opportunity for, we have many survivors who will be here telling their stories. We also will have some mothers who are protective mothers who are doing their best to try to protect children in extremely abusive environments, and they're finding out that the government, who is supposed to protect them, is doing just the opposite. We'll have time to talk about that as well. This is one of the great tragedies, is that something horrible is going on, but the people that we all should be able to trust to help us don't seem to be doing their job. And that is why it is my belief that we must have a citizens movement to correct this terrible wrong. Now, you may wonder, what good can people do, just individual people? Those of you who may be familiar with the history of the mafia may know that the, maybe I should ask, do any of you believe the mafia exists? One person over there, okay. Did you know that there was a group that came out that said the mafia did not exist? And in fact, they persuaded the governor of New York at that time to become a member. They affected the production of The Godfather, so they took the word mafia out. And in fact, I have to admit that for a long time I didn't know if there was such a thing as the mafia, and I didn't use that word out of respect to Italian Americans. I still do respect Italian Americans, but I know that the mafia does exist because in 1989 the FBI did finally get a tape, an audio tape of a mafia initiation ceremony. Anyway, not the false memory syndrome, not them, but this organization trying to protect Italians eventually did succeed in convincing many people that the mafia did not exist. In fact, it does exist. Well, the interesting thing, though, I'm going about this in a very circuitous way. Many of you know that the mafia did not first start in New York. That was not really where it first got started. I think there's an excellent parallel here between the mafia and these various agencies of the government and individuals practicing these deviant acts, because the bottom line is they're engaging in criminal behavior. Organized crime is a kind of organized crime, and we know that our government is capable of engaging in organized crime. We're learning that more and more all the time. But the mafia, since it did begin in New Orleans, it was first operative in New Orleans, was very successful, and there were some cases that came up where people complained, and there were efforts to prosecute mafiosi, but they were entirely unsuccessful. Aren't you all amazed? That the local government was unable to effectively prosecute the mafiosi in the late 1800s in New Orleans. This comes as a shock to many of you, I understand. But the mafia were essentially driven out of New Orleans. Not entirely, obviously. I don't think you can ever totally eliminate, and I'm sure they're back there now. But how was it done? It was done by a citizens movement, by a grassroots group of people who decided they were not going to have this in their community anymore. So it is my belief that if we truly want to see this kind of horror stop, that it's something that we as citizens, we as human beings will have to make that commitment to. And I'm hoping that that our organization in part, and the other, you've heard about other organizations here looking toward that same goal, that as we join together as a whole, we will be successful in this endeavor. In any case, I do want to welcome you all to this conference, and I would like at this point to open up the floor for any discussion, any comments, or any questions that you might have of any of the speakers here. Thank you very much. Please. Excuse me a sec. We probably need to get a microphone down there so that everyone can hear you. I don't know who here is the microphone expert. Do you have someone back there who can help with the microphone?
This one. Is this attached? I don't think it is.
We don't see anyone forthcoming with the microphone back there, so I would just ask, please, that you speak up very loudly so everybody can hear you.
Okay, we'll try. I brought up this issue with Auschwitz. He walked